honored and pleased to speak to such a noble audience. And also big thanks for the British Computer Society for having me. So again, great honor, great pleasure. My name is Krzysztof Rubiniec, and the topic for today is Lean Subscription Model. And what is the Lean Subscription Model? It's a CMDB architecture that was created with change management in mind. And speaking more specifically, the architecture is derived from the approval process. So the idea is as simple as I created only 3 slides to explain it, one of which is an everyday life example. So I hope this is the power of the methodology, and that's why I at some point will name it as a Lean. So there are only 3 slides with the theory, but obviously the presentation will not end up on 3 slides only, because as the theme of this conference is automation, I will show also a means of automating the deployment of the LSM model, and there is also a tiny bit of automation within the model itself. It's called automation propagation, or risk propagation. So welcome, and let me invite you to the journey to the Lean Subscription Model. So let's start with the problem statement. So I think that everyone has seen a CAB meeting having 50 or more participants twice a week, spending an hour discussing changes without really deep understanding of the nature of the changes. Or in one of the organizations I was working for, there was a router change that required an approval from more than 50 senior executives on the business side. So how much understanding of the nature of the change can business have? But I think this type of issue is still quite happening in change management, isn't it? So on one hand, in change management, the issue is that we have excessive approvals, but paradoxically at the same time, many organizations face missing approvals as well. So as a kind of warm-up for today's session, I prepared a small poll to see how vast the problem is, how many of us experience the same issue with additional approvals, not needed approvals, missing approvals, with making approvals just enough, the approval process. So if I could ask everyone to scan the barcode, go to the web page and fill the poll, it's very simple. The question is, do excessive approvals cause waste effort in your organization? And the answers are just yes or no. So Alpha, can I ask you to enable the poll, please? And can I ask the audience to vote? Let's see how many of us have the same issue with change management.
Okay, so far, it's quite interesting that we seem to be having 50-50 at the moment. There are a number of people who seem to not be having the issue of wasted change approvals, but there are still plenty that do.
That's excellent. I'm happy that it's not that common, that there are some organizations who know how to cope with it. So yes, thank you very much. Are we going to finish the poll now, or there are any still responses coming?
No, actually, so it looks like we haven't had any response for a couple of moments. So it seems to be tied. 50-50. So apparently half the organizations out there have got the right way of doing it. Let's see if it's the same as your way.
Okay, let's see if we can help with the half that has the problem. Okay, so let's start discussing the LSM model. So I listed here out of the box connection types that are delivered to the market by one of the top service management software providers. And these connections are normally used to enable change management. So if you screen through the connection types, it doesn't really seem to be created with the change management in mind. It's more intended to enable an incident management, isn't it? So that's the most probably the root cause of the issues that many organizations have with properly defining change management approval process. And having the problem defined, let's discuss the theory. And let's discuss the before mentioned real life example. So the process of upbringing kids. So in the process, at the beginning, parents are the one who decide of everything, when the baby eats, where the baby goes to sleep, etc. And then parents give more and more freedom to a child, and it's the child who makes up the decision. And somewhere around the teenager age, there is a new phenomena like, Dad, I'll be back around 10, or Mom, I'll stay at Jessica's for the night. So, however, in this case, there is still, imagine a 12-year-old kid saying, I would like to make a crazy tattoo on my forehead. So I think many parents would react. So there is a third type of control, which I would name for the time being kind of soft control. There is the information, but there is a still space for veto from the parent. So from the parent standpoint, we have three use cases here. It's either the decision of the parent side, or the decision is done by the kid, or there is this third type like shared accountability. There is information and the opportunity to give a veto. So if you are with me now, then actually we have done all the work. So we defined all the requirements for the CMDB for the CMDB architecture using this everyday life example. So we have only two more steps to do to discuss the theory. One is to transfer the way of everyday common way of thinking into the change management, and then define the CMDB architecture in the very same way. So this is the change management. And in IT language, the three types of control would be either the active approval, when the parent CI is asked to approve the change, or there is no approval needed. And it's not a trivial use case, because at some point in the model, we will use the connection types to discuss the risk assessment. And obviously, each and every change has to be registered in the change management register for obvious reasons. And there is this partial control when there is an email sent saying, by Friday C of B, let me know if you have anything against the change that we are going to implement over weekend. Kind of speak now or keep your peace forever. So speaking the CMDB architecture language, we need only three connection types to fully enable change management and change control. So we need to have an active approval. I'm trying to find my laser pointer. So we need only three types of connections. It's active approval, represented by solid line, when the parent decides when the child CI may pursue the change or not. It's passive approval with dashed line. The email sent with the option of veto, and no approval with a dotted line. And that's all that we need to properly enable change management. And if there is anything that I would like to stay in your memory from this model, this is this very slide, because this is the core of the lean subscription model. We need only 3 connection types to properly enable change management. And that's why that the name of the methodology has the part of lean. We need only 3 connection types in the CMDB. So now, simple but not a trivial example. So that's a big data service that I was trying to set change management for. So it uses a couple of standard components, and at the core of the service is the PMML model, which is similar to XML. It contains the machine learning prediction model. So the service manager was getting approvals from all the CIs that were subject to change. So, but in reality, all the URLs, API, scoring engine were a standard technology that was very much reliable. And the service manager wanted to know only what happens with the PMML. And in reality, in the LSM model, this is how the change management has been defined. So we had the no approval connections between all the CIs, because the because the service owner was not interested in the CI, in the changes running on those CIs, and there was only connection between the service and the PMML as the active approval. So I think it's a good point for having questions.
Okay, so far I haven't seen any questions pop up. I don't know if that's if there's still detail sinking in. If anybody wants to pop in a question, you've got time. Otherwise, we'll move on and deal with any questions that come up a little later.
Okay. So Mike, let's make an exercise. So on the left-hand side, there is an average service having local load balancers in 2 data centers. So there is there are 2 parts of the service, and in the traditional model, when there is a router change that we were discussing at the beginning, all the 50 senior executives from the business were getting requests for approval. And on the right-hand side, I assumed that because of the global load balancer, there is a high reliability in the system. And actually, we don't need active approvals for the changes in one of the systems running in one of the data centers. And also the layer at the top, at the bottom, with the VM and clusters, it's fully reliable. So this part of the infrastructure does not require any approvals at all. So the exercise is to try to calculate the waste reduction in the system. So on the left-hand side, we have certain number of active approvals. And on the right-hand side, because of the high reliability of the load balancing and the cluster layers, the number of approvals is reduced. So the question is to calculate number of approvals in the classical change management system, then compare it with the LSM, and that should give us the waste reduction. So on the left-hand side, there is a certain number of active approvals, it's X. On the right-hand side, there is a certain number of active approvals as well, depicted with the solid lines. And then if we normalize it by X, the formula on the bottom, we have the percentage reduction in the waste. So let me give like 3 minutes for the exercise. And let's try to estimate the reduction in waste in the LSM model.
Just before you do all go off grabbing your pieces of paper and scrabbling around and trying to do a precise calculation, I will let you know that Christoph's made this a multiple choice poll. So you won't need a precise answer. So just so people can get to the poll, do you have the link to it?
Oh yes, sorry. It's the same link. Arthur, if you could enable the second poll on the web page, please. Okay,
yep.
Good. So now, let me move that pointer from this.
Okay, I'll just pop back to the poll, see if we're getting answers coming through. Okay. Yes, we seem to, there seems to be rather a consensus that the saving is greater than 8%. So they're thinking that 12% is not enough, although a couple of people seem to think that 12% was about how much waste reduction they could manage to get. But overwhelmingly, the highest proportion of people seem to think that 80% was how much could be saved. Sounds quite a lot to me, but you're the expert, Christoph. What's the answer?
Yeah, that's really 80%. It's an average. You know, it's an example, but I don't think it's very much away from the reality, because we see such systems. Obviously, for some users, they have the change management that is properly tuned in, but for a couple of organizations I was advising to, there was this methodology where all the approvals were considered were transitioned through the CMDB connections. And here on the left hand side we have 30 connections, and on the right hand side there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 active approvals that are left. So the reduction in waste in this case is 80%.
Fantastic. I'm glad I didn't work in those two organizations. Okay.
So now, yeah, as we know about the theory, let me speak about how to get it implemented. So I will speed up a little bit now, be conscious of time, because there is quite a bit of theory of topics to be discussed. And everything that I'm sharing now is presented in a white paper that I wrote with my friend Roxanne Schoel, who is with us tonight. So if you have any questions, if you need more details, please don't hesitate to grab the white paper and read through it and ask questions. I'm to your service. I will share my the details of my contact at the end. So where to start? Imagine there are tens of thousands of CIs or hundreds of thousands, and you would like to implement the SLLSM. So there is obviously some way of automation that is required. You cannot ask each and every stakeholder what type of connection they would like to have between specific CIs. It must be a big scale automation. So the idea that's presented in the white paper is a baseline risk. So baseline risk is a framework for the big scale LSM model implementation. So the is the control level is proportional to the risk. So we say every connection that is high risk requires an active approval. So we attribute to the connection the solid light connection type. Medium risk requires a passive approval, the email with information with the veto option, and low risk has no approval. So I'll give you a couple of examples how to define the baseline risk. So for instance, we have an application running on a server, and the server is a single point of failure. In this case, we attribute the connection the solid line, so it requires an active approval. Then if an application is running on a VM that can be easily replaced, let's assume that this is a passive approval only. And if we have an EC2, obviously in an auto-scaling group, then the EC2 can easily be automatically recovered. So in this case, we don't need any approval for a change that is imposed on the EC2. Or we can take into account an architecture. So when we have an application running on a single server, so the server again is a single point of failure. So we attribute a solid connection line between the two CIs. If it's hot-cold, let's say, architecture, then we may just require an information about the change that is going to happen. Or if it's hot, we don't mind really what's going to happen with the servers because it's hot, it's fully reliable. Then we can have a business-driven, big scale definition or assumption of the connection types. So for instance, systems that are from SLA standpoint, from customer standpoint, bronze, would require no approvals, and gold may require mainly the active approvals. We can also define that the sandbox environments do not need approvals at all, test, let's say, passive approvals, and for the production systems, the center of gravity will be on active approvals. And the model is as flexible as we can go to the individual perception of risk. So there are some parts of organization or teams that are more or less risk adverse. So we can say for this team, they like more control. So why not to give them the opportunity to impose more control on the systems that they support? And the idea is to build a high-level approximation of the connection type. So we may say everything, a virtual machine running on cluster server. Is cluster server highly reliable? Yes, it is. So we can give a no approval connection. For database running on a cluster, again, no approval. For application running on a VM, it can be passive approval, etc., etc. So actually, having that kind of definition, we can run a Python script on our CMDB and build a big scale connection types between all the CIs, irrespectively of how large currently the CMDB is. And the main thing is that we are not intending to replace existing connections, because these are used for incident management. We are going to build a parallel set of connections to properly enable the change management. Perhaps there are any questions to that by now, Arthur?
Just checking if the only question that's come up was whether or not the 80% was correct, because somebody managed to come up with 50%, but well, certainly closer to 80 than to 12. But so far, yes, and one person did point out, unfortunately, there seems to be the occasional little bit of lag on the sound, but hopefully that will abate itself soon. Otherwise, if you'd like to continue, Christoph.
Yes, sorry, thank you.
Wait,
sorry for the
sorry. No, sorry. There is just a question from Richard has come in. How do you handle the effort to maintain 2 sets of CI dependency models?
As much as it's possible automatically. So the baseline is defined once and forever, and then there are some individual preferences of the CI owners that can be taken into account. But as much as possible, it should be automated, and the baseline risk is defined to work this way.
Okay. So it's essentially you manage one as the main baseline. Okay. So that's the only question we've got so far. If you'd like to continue.
Okay, thank you. So now a little bit of further considerations about the contextual risk, which is actually the very same as we usually name as risk assessment. So what happens if there is a change? Because the baseline risk is a risk that defines the connection types without any change happening in the system. And now we are going to the use case, which is at the core of change management, so actual change. So we have some context of each change, and the context is usually taken into account as risk assessment. And this is what we do in this model as well. So there are 3 connection types, and we can amend the connection type taking into account what happens with specific change. So if it's a medium or normal change, then this is the level of control is the same as it was defined in the baseline risk. When we go through high or very high very high change risk, then we need to increase the control level proportionally. And similarly, if there is a low or very low risk change, we need to decrease the level of control. So in the model, we can change the connection type depending on what happens in particular change and the risk propagates. So this is a very, it's an abstract example of a CI that undergoes a change. And this is some assumed type of connections in the CMDB. And the change, the risk assessment showed that it's a high level risk. So high level risk increases the connection type by 1 level. So from no approval, we go to passive approval between the CI in subject and the parent CI, and then the risk propagates. So all the CIs that subscribed for controlling the G changes also change the level of control. And in the extreme situation, when it's a very high risk change, all the connection types turn from what they were into the active approval. So we can, in a flexible way, adopt the model and the level of control to the actual situation and actual change. And a little bit more what is in white paper, if I manage to get somebody interested in with the LSM model. So we define the 4 implementation phases. So we need to discover the dependencies, which is usually done by the existing CMDB. We need to define the baseline risk, as I discussed about, as I explained in the framework. Then we need to define the contextual risk factors, which will enable the risk assessment. And then it's about automating the propagation of the risk and level of control, as I described in previous slides. So there is also in the white paper, there is a couple of mathematical, very simple math that will help enable the automation of the process. There's also a framework called LSM policy, if you would like to write one and define the LSM model. So summarizing, the approval reduction, or the OPEX, the burden reduction in an average system may be up to 80%, depending on how your current change management approval process works. The architecture of the CMDB is very simple. There are only 3 connection types. It's easy to automate it. There is also a methodology for the risk propagation. And there is a white papers with details. So preparing a summary slide, I was looking for a quote, and I found a quote saying that there are no shortcuts for success, this one. And I thought to myself that perhaps, well, there are so many authors of quotes, so perhaps I could have my own one. So this is the one that I created for today. So I think that there are shortcuts to success in IT, and LSM is one of these. It is a shortcut for the change management. If you struggle with excessive number of approvals, it can make your system lean. It can make your system fit for purpose. So please, if you are interested, download the white paper. Please don't hesitate to contact me and ask questions. I'm to your service. So, are there any questions, perhaps? Now?
Okay, thank you very much for that. I hope there's no friends of Annika in the room, but a number of people are saying in the chat that they like your quote better than hers. So it looks like you've got some useful support there. There was a question, Ian. I don't know if you'd like to just come off mute. Your question you were asking about when we were looking at the contextual risk, you were asking about risk and change management.
Hello. Yes. So in change management in an agile world, how can we ensure that changes that really need proper thought out approval at a high level don't get bogged down with the day-to-day way of working agile, whereby people are given a remit and they can approve changes themselves within limits?
Oh yeah. The DevOps environment is a challenge if they can approve. I don't think it's classical change management, and we more tend to discuss here the ITIL side when everything is more defined and it's orchestrated between various stakeholders. And here the assumption is that each CI has its owner, and the owner feels accountable for the change. But there are also other CIs that are dependent on the specific CI, and there are other owners that require each change to be really well-defined, controlled, and properly implemented.
So in a large organization, which may have many different areas that are implementing change with thousands of different CIs, whether that be end user devices or server or software, how can we get better at ensuring that change is impacted and results in better change?
Well, the model is more for automating the change management and really coping with the non-proportional number of approvals. And change management itself, it requires appropriate policy and support from senior executives to be really followed. So the model doesn't answer all the questions, doesn't address all the challenges. It's more for the approval process and making it fit for purpose and lean.
Thanks.
Okay. There was a question. Richard put his hand up, and seeing as he's my boss, he's the chair of this committee, I thought I'd allow him to speak directly himself.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
Fantastic. Yeah, first, fantastic presentation. I really like the examples you're giving earlier about the teenagers and the tattoo on the forehead of the 12-year-old. I would definitely be reusing that myself. Question I have for you is, in terms of managing the role of the various CIs in the CMDB, how do you handle applications within that base model? So that's what I'm thinking here is you mentioned earlier a lot about you know, they can be standalone single point of failures, or they can be highly redundant servers, which means the you know, risk affected. Whereas applications, they tend to be kind of a behemoth of stuff, and you could be correcting a spec on a form, or you could be affecting something which has got very critical business processes running through it.
So Richard, I apologize, the voice was a bit choppy. So you were asking about applications, and specifically, what's the question? Could you please repeat that?
How do you handle, or how do the risk for an application? So when you're logging a change, the risk approval and decision making is driven from that.
Mm-hmm. The challenge is more not within the model, but with the definition of application itself. So what do we consider as a CI? Is it the application as an abstract thing, or we consider each and every instance of an application as a CI? So there is a broader discussion also about what we consider to be a service, because when you go from the very basic technical layer up into direction of business, the CIs become more and more abstract. The question, what to do with applications? Applications obviously should be registered in CMDB, in my opinion, because they are still a part of CMDB. Nevertheless, and they should be a standard part of the CMDB. So the challenge with applications is in how we define the definitions. But as soon as we have the definition, in my opinion, applications should be a standard part of the CMDB and follow the same rules as the other CIs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we haven't had any more questions entered into the chat or the Q&A. I can kind of understand how some of the questions that we've been having, Ian and Richard both produced quite complicated questions, so I can understand why you didn't manage to type those in. Perhaps if somebody does have a question that they find too difficult to type in, you could raise your hand. We've got a couple of minutes left, so you know, if somebody did want to raise an additional question, then I'd happily take that direct in voice.
So perhaps in the meantime, we could do like very last poll.
Absolutely,
please.
yes. Let's.
So the question is, do you see a value from implementing LSM in your organization?
The killer question.
Yeah.
Okay, so that poll is open. If anybody attending would like to scan that in on their phone and respond. Okay, we are starting to see value. Okay, so it's quite interesting to see how at the beginning there was the perception from the members of the audience who responded that in about half of the cases there weren't excessive approvals. And that they thought they'd got it just right. But now, very interestingly, after having seen your explanation of what's at the same time quite a simple change, but actually is quite involved in doing it, you've explained that to us very nicely. We've actually got 80% of people who think they could see value from implementing a lean subscription model in their own CMDB.
Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. That's all I prepared for today.
Okay,
so enjoy the rest of your
questions?
evening. In case of any questions, yeah, don't hesitate to contact me.
Absolutely. I put the link to the white paper into the chat if anybody wants to pick that up. And do you have a slide with your contact details, Christoph?
Yes, it's the previous one, this one. Thank you.
Fantastic. There. Find Christoph on LinkedIn. Okay. Yes, Marilyn's asked about the white paper link that has been shared in the chat. So if you can find the chat, or you can read it off the bottom of this link, it's quite straightforward, b.link/lean subs. So hopefully you've got time to write that down quickly.